Hello， 大家好，我是立恩。我们上一期做过 Jordan Peterson 跟英国 Channel 4 News 主持人 Cathy Newman 非常受到大家热烈欢迎的一场采访，那就是谈到了有关于是否男女的薪资平等上面确实存在的这个偏见或歧视，还有呢，在片尾的时候也是点燃了这个全场这一个采访的高潮精华，就是当主持人问到 Jordan Peterson。凭什么你的言论自由可以来冒犯这个跨性别人士的时候呢 ？Jordan Peterson 的精彩的答辩，也就是任何人的言论自由都可以为了理性思考而必须承担冒犯别人的风险，就如同主持人自己也已经在冒犯到 Jordan Peterson 本人了。但是 Jordan Peterson 却觉得很好啊，你本来就该这样做，特别你是记者。好，这一部影片受到非常多网友的欢迎。这当中呢，我看到一则留言，确实也提出了一个很好的问题。有一名网友就提到说，那如果说是言语霸凌呢？难道言语霸凌也可以纳入在言论自由的范围内吗？那我们能够允许吗？这个其实是一个好问题。
Nice。
我呢，今天特别找了一段非常知名的牛津大学联合会在2018年6月的时候邀请 Peterson 教授呢来做一个讲座。我给大家介绍一个简单的科普牛津大学的联合会是世界上最著名的辩论社之一自1823年他们成立以来呢，他们一直在致力于讨论各种相关议题，而且它的辩论的范围其实是全球性的。这个联合会后来的名气高到什么程度呢？就是他们常常请非常多知名的，不管是左派或是右派的人士也好，进行辩论，而且还全球转播。牛津大学有一个非常非常推崇言论自由以及辩论的风气。那大家都知道说 Jordan Peterson 教授因为上的这个 Cathy Newman 的采访节目呢而一战成名，所以呢牛津大学这次邀请他，就是希望 Jordan Peterson 教授再来去分享。刚好我找的这个片段就是在这个讲座上呢，有一个亚裔的年轻同学呢，思考也非常的缜密，他就问了 Peterson 教授关于所谓言论霸凌或者说言语霸凌这样的一个行为，难道不该受到政府的相关的规范吗？那我们来看看 Jordan Peterson 教授要怎么样的来阐述他的理念。这部影片的时间不会太长，然后因为学生是提出这样的问题，所以并不是辩论，所以我反而觉得这部影片很好的能够更聚焦在广泛的去探讨所谓言论自由度这样的一件事情。让我们一起来看看 Jordan Peterson 教授是怎么说的吧。Let's go。
I just want to first thank your comments on things like political correctness and the obsession of certain elements of the left on campuses to screen out discourse, because I genuinely think that is an issue and problem in the status quo. But following on from that, I just want to pick your thoughts on what you say about freedom of speech and discussions in general, right? Because you basically flagged that, I think, in your answers just then, that freedom of speech has an instrumental purpose. It's there to help us find truth, correct me if I'm wrong, to identify the correctness or the logos against the possible consequence of blood and death. So here's the question, right? If I, as an individual, am affected by discourse in a way that doesn't cause physical violence, so that's not banned by hate speech laws and whatnot, but makes me feel so deeply uncomfortable that I don't belong to society or this community, or when I say something, whenever I try to say something, I'm ridiculed because of my race, the way I talk, or my gender, or the way I behave, then surely that means that my valuable insight to contribute towards logos, towards the pursuit of truth, is shut out by other people's more vociferous speech and more dominant speech. And this is what we see in cases of campuses, whether it be from the right or the left, of people using very violent and loud language to drown out dissent, to drown out those who oppose them on campuses, in society and whatnot. From Donald Trump to people in Swarthmore, we've seen this happen. So wouldn't you say that the attempt to claw back or the right of freedom of speech isn't so far absolute as instrumental? And based on that, therefore, there are some cases where freedom of speech of some individuals can be curtailed if we want to get the better appreciation of the logos and a better inclusion of more voices that are currently being shut out as a result of the extremity and radicalism of those select few. Wouldn't you say that's the case? Thank you.
容许我在这边稍微打岔，以免真的有观众朋友听他讲话速度太快，以至于无法理解哈。这个同学简单讲就是说，他认为在学校或者说在社会里头，普遍都有一个现象，就是有的人因为他的言论或者说他的口才非常的雄辩，他却比较大程度的呢会去让很多人不敢去表达自己的声音。那这样的人呢，他可能是一些比较极端的左派或是右派呢，他们会用非常非常激烈的这样的一个主张，好使得有些人呢就觉得说，哎呀，你这么会讲，那或者说好像你这样讲就是让大家都不能够去发表自己的声音，免得就会被你好比说言语上去做攻击。那这学员就问说，我们是不是应该去减少或者说去约束这些人的言论，好使得大家可以有一个更公开更敢自由表达的这样的一个氛围，不然的话有的人还会因为别人的言论自由而造成的自身的言论自由的一个被压迫。 OK， 我们来听听 Jordan Peterson 教授是怎么回答的。
Well, there's a very simple answer to that, which is yes, but I'll elaborate. I mean, the first thing is, like, I'm not an admirer of hate speech laws, but that doesn't mean that I'm naive enough to think that there's no such thing as hate speech. So obviously, if you've ever been involved in an extremely serious argument, you know perfectly well that there's such a thing as hate speech, because you've probably uttered some. So, you know, and there's also no doubt that there are forms of speech that are utterly reprehensible, and some of those are actually already punished by law. You can't incite to violence, you can't libel someone, right? So we have some restrictions already on what's acceptable discourse. Whether it's the case, typically speaking, that some people have more privileged access to free speech than others, well, that's obviously the case. I mean, that's part of power. And power is one of the means by which people climb hierarchies, although the more you can climb a hierarchy by exercising power, the more that's an indication of the fact that that hierarchy has become corrupt. So there's no doubt that these structural impediments to the free exchange of discourse exist. There's also no doubt, as you already laid out, that that's not in everyone's best interest, because what you want, if you have any sense in your society, and this is also why I think that we've put proper emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, is that you want everyone's logos to have the opportunity to clarify the unknown and reconstitute the world. And if you shut that down, then you risk getting access to the unique insights that that individual might bring. Okay, so I agree with your diagnosis completely. And I think that, you know, even in the West, to ignore the fact that many of our hierarchies tilt towards tyranny and that prejudice still exists in multiple forms is a mistake, although it's only one factor among many and shouldn't be identified as the primary causal determinant of each individual's life. I think that's a dreadful error. The question is, what do you do about it? And the devil's in the details. And as I said already, I'm not an admirer, for example, of hate speech laws, even though there's plenty of hateful speech, because I think the best thing to do is to leave free speech alone as much as you possibly can. Not because that will result in the perfect conditions for free speech, but because anything else that you're likely to do is going to make it worse rather than better. And so that's how it looks to me.
这边我快速总结一下，它虽然是一个反对仇恨歧视言论法，也就是说不应该订定法律去限定什么叫歧视，什么叫仇恨，但是Jordan教授也说，这并不会让他天真的以为这世界上就没有仇恨或歧视的言论，当然有。关于霸凌、侮辱、诽谤等等，这些政府已经有相关的法律规范，已经有做限制了，所以这个地方他其实不是太担心。在目前的社会结构里头，越有权力的人，他越可以靠着权力去往上爬的时候呢，那么这些人他的言论自由度其实反而某种程度上会更大，对吧？因为他可以用他的权力去表达更多他的个人看法，但是同样的也利用了权力可能去压制了其他人表达声音的意见。可是这个问题反而 Jordan Peterson 教授说，这就是为什么我们反而应该对于个人的言论自由要做更大的一个保障，因为事实上你越少的去 用政府的权力去规范人们的言论自由，反而你是在保障少数人。所以如果你越去订立法规的话，其实你会发现越多的言论自由只会往那个有权力的人那边去靠拢。如果我们想要对个人的言论自由做更多其他以外的事情，去影响言论自由的话，那你多半只会做得更糟，而不会更好。当你做得越多的时候，你更有冒着一个会失去掉听到其他人声音的这样的一个风险。那这个同学呢，就针对 Peterson 教授回答呢，又有新的提问了。我们来听听看。
Very quickly.
So, just want to pick your brains on hate speech laws, because it seems that you agree that the pursuit of logos and logic and some sort of achievement of individualization, individual autonomy that is the end goal of discussion here, right? So let's assume, like, correct me if I'm wrong again, that's the end objective. Here's the thing, it seems
I wouldn't say that exactly. I wouldn't say that exactly. I think that's too individualistic. I would say that what you want is two things happening simultaneously, is that you want to maximize individual development, but you want to do that in a way that brings the greatest amount of harmony simultaneously possible to the familial unit and also to the broader social unit. So those interests have to be stacked. It's like what's best for you, but that's also in a manner that's best for your family and for your community. So it's not purely individual.
So on that basis of achieving communal harmony and individual freedom at the same time, wouldn't you say that there's certain forms of free speech or hate speech that are so vehement and so de-dignifying that it disrupts both local harmony within communities, but also makes individuals feel as if they can't really engage in retaliatory, clarificatory discourse against them because they fear the potential repercussions, even if it doesn't lead to violence. They just fear it so much that it might irrationally or rationally even drive them to not speak.
It happens all the time. In fact, it's the standard situation. If you look across the world, most societies don't do a good job of either promoting or allowing free speech. I don't know how we ever managed it. It's so unlikely because it's so hard on people and hard on those who occupy positions of power in tyrannical hierarchies that I can't believe that any society's ever managed to figure it out at all. So those dangers are always there. And I also think the highest likelihood often is that societies that do put high value on free speech will lose that because it's so difficult to maintain. So, but with regards to hate speech, for example, let's say that things would be much better if there was less hateful speech. It's like, seems highly probable to me, especially if you look at the more egregious forms of hateful speech. How best to regulate it? Well, my sense is you let those who wish to utter hateful things do so and let everyone hear them, because that's the best way to ensure that what they're saying will be understood and rejected. Now, in order to posit that, you have to assume that the population composed of sovereign individuals is wiser than it is foolish. And, that's a tight... That's a hope. You might think about it as an axiom of faith, but I do believe it to be the case. I think that if you put the evidence in front of people, by and large, they will do the right thing. I think that the problem with regulating hate speech, it's very simple. Who defines hate? And the answer to that is, over any reasonable period of time, exactly the people you would least want to have define hate. And so the consequences of the regulation become incalculably worse as a problem than the problem that they were designed to deal with. To think otherwise is to think in a sort of utopian manner. It's like, well, we have a problem, hate speech. Well, we can come up with a solution and there will be no problems with that solution. It's like, no, that isn't how the world works. When I'm negotiating with my clinical clients, one of the things I always tell them is, often, because they're in difficult circumstances, and often not for psychological reasons, it's like, no, you don't understand. You're screwed both ways. You don't have an option here where you're not going to suffer. That's what it means to be in a bad situation. You're going to pay a price both ways. You can pick your price. Okay, so we're going to have hate speech, or we're going to have the consequences of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech. Well, I know what the consequences are of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech, is that things get a lot worse because hate's very difficult to define. And that's actually a real problem when you're trying to regulate it because you have to be able to define it. And we're already at a point where, well, you made someone uncomfortable. Why isn't that hate speech? I mean, I was basically asked that by one of your most outstanding journalists or your most popular journalists. Well, why should you have the right to say something that's offensive? It's like... We can think that through. Let's think that through for a minute. So, I mean, my riposte to her, essentially, although this wasn't directly it, was that's not a very smart question for a journalist to be asking, right? Because of all people who should never ask that question would be stand-up comics, right? And journalists. Because that's all they ever do. That's what it means to be a journalist, is to ask a question that's going to be offensive to someone. Who the hell wants to hear about what you've discovered unless it's about something contentious and important? So it was a jaw-dropping question as far as I was concerned. And the fact that it was a jaw-dropping question was part of the reason why that video went viral. Okay, so now let's think about offensiveness as part of hate. Okay, so the first thing we might say is that you really need to think when you have a difficult problem. And a difficult problem is one where there's something at stake. It might be your life, it might be your well-being, but and then we might say, well, there's going to be a diversity of opinions about that particular conundrum if it actually happens to be difficult. And so even to discuss it, because if you discuss it, you're going to discuss option A, it's going to annoy all the people who want option B, or you're going to discuss option B, and that's going to annoy all the people that want option A, and maybe there's 10 options. So if you're going to discuss anything of any real significance whatsoever, you're going to make people hot under the collar and you're going to risk offending them. Okay, so what, you just stop talking about difficult things? And the answer to that is yes, and that's what's happening. But then there's another problem, which is there isn't anything I could conceivably say about anything that isn't going to offend someone if the crowd is large enough. So you might say, well, if you're talking to two people, you can't offend one of them. So you don't get to offend 50% of the population. It's like, okay, let's say I'm talking to 1,000 people, and one person finds what I'm saying offensive. Say, well, that's hateful. It's like, well, that's 1 in 1,000. So should I stop? What if it's 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000,000? Like, where's the cutoff? And you might think, well, we'll work that out. It's like, no. You don't get it. The devil's in the details. You work it out now when you formulate your restrictions on free speech. You don't shunt that off into the future so that it's a problem that'll be solved. Who defines hate? Insoluble problem. Don't regulate it, because you can't define it. That's how it looks to me. So you have the free marketplace of ideas, so to speak, where the collective can render a judgment on the acceptability of an idea on an ongoing basis. And that isn't a great solution, because we don't have great solutions. We have partial, fragmentary solutions that make us somewhat less abjectly miserable than we might be. That's what we have. And if we try to eradicate that kind of risk completely, all we do is magnify a different kind of risk.
Thank you.
好，最后我们已经看完了。Jordan Peterson 教授他提出的一个很重要的角度，就是说，与其我们去限制那些仇恨言论的人，其实更应该去让他们表达出来。因为两种的一个方向，你其实都会有利有弊。可是他并不认为说，用规范言论自由的方式反而会是一个好的选择，他认为这样会导致更多的风险跟更多的问题，反而是我们宁可相信大多数的群众，当越多的人听到了这种所谓仇恨的声音，而且更能够理解他们的仇恨的时候，很多人他就可以更有理性的去了解说，你这样的一个言论主张其实是武断或者说是错误的。反而社会大众可以更好的拒绝这样的群体的存在。好，因为社会大众自然会做一个公平的一个判断。我自己是觉得这个确实是一个非常有趣的议题。为什么呢？我们可以知道说，现在看到网络上面也很多充斥着所谓的言语霸凌，可是 有趣的是，网络是一个两面刃，它随着更多的一个所谓的言论，或者说更多的一些隐藏的这些事情被曝光、被发酵之后，其实社会大众也更容易去辨别出来，就是事件的背后是不是哪一方是真的是有问题或是有错的，对吗？回过头来，也会有更多人反而他会去抵制这种网络霸凌。就是如果这个网络霸凌它确实只是一种霸凌，它不是正确的话，其实也有很多人会去讨伐。我觉得在群众之间，我们互相的大家群体性的去探讨对错的时候，其实我倒是认为很大程度的会慢慢的越来越多的去消减掉非理性的声音。但是当然啦，网络上面环境很复杂，我们知道可以有所谓的花钱买网军、买水军，好，造成一个看起来人多势众的现象。可是这个绝对不能够限缩在你不保障个人的言论自由，因为换句话讲，就算你限制了个人言论自由，买网军、买水军的这种现象，其实它也并不会就停止或不发生，反而我们要让更多的人的理性声音能够出得来，好，那才有可能造成一个对于刻意背后的这种团体式的攻击，也是一个相对我觉得比较好的一个抵制的一个方式。OK， 那今天呢，要请大家特别原谅我呢，好不好？就是中间呢有一些打断，我通常如果在做稍微我觉得比较有一点深度议题的影片的时候呢，我会忍不住希望多一点补充，是因为我希望我们的受众群呢，大部分都能够清楚的、充分的理解到这个影片所探讨的比较深度的核心价值。但是我发现，哎呀，我的订阅群啊、观众啊，真的是都太聪明了。我看到大家好多的留言呢，我都觉得哇，其实爱看我们观众的影片哈，
看我们影片的观众啊，
都非常的富有深刻的思想。我自己很欣赏大家，也非常的开心大家能够对我发的这些影片那么的感兴趣。我觉得真的现在短影音时代，我觉得会充斥太多的都是浅薄文化，而这个浅薄文化其实我相信对于我们自身或者说我们的下一代来讲，其实都是一个潜在的伤害跟威胁。所以我很希望跟大家多分享这类的影片呢，那也希望呢大家不吝给我回馈，给我留言，让我知道你们的想法。每一个朋友的留言，无论你是认同不认同影片的，我都非常的欣赏。那我会忍不住想回应你，绝对不是为了要冒犯你，我的第一优先都是因为你激起了我更多的一些我想回应的理性思考。所以呢，正如还是 Peterson 教授那句老话，如果我们要能够坚持理性思考，我们还是要甘冒会冒犯别人的风险。那这也是我自己稍微愿意付出的代价，但是希望让大家知道，其实我的第一目的绝对不是要让你感觉到被冒犯。圣经以弗所书4章29节说，污秽的言语一句都不可说出口，只要随时说造就人的好话，叫听见的人得益处。那箴言12章18节也说，有人说话如刀刺人，智慧人的舌头却为医人的良药。其实我们如果真的是要很大程度的去获得别人的尊重，或者是说，真的在言语上面，你想要让你的声音更多的被别人听见的话，其实我们是需要有智慧、有方法，而且我们其实要避免去惹动别人的怒气。有的时候很多言语，你真的去惹动别人怒气的时候，当然别人反过来他也容易去压制你。好，那么这有的时候就是在言论自由程度上面，我们自己有没有一定程度的责任去让别人限制了我们的言论自由，我觉得这也是要去思想的。OK， 很高兴跟大家有机会能够分享这么有意义的一次深入探讨言论自由的节目。我们这边是超级神队友，我们下期再见，拜拜。
Christ alone.